Well, welcome back, Michael and Kenzi, for part 2 of our 3-part series on the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the international scheduling of cannabis. Thank you so much for being with us again today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And that brings me to this this assessment of cannabis made by the World Health Organization, WHO. They never made it. In 60 years of existence, they have never assessed cannabis. They have never really looked into it, the scientific evidence, the data, and they made it finally. It took them 3 years between 2016 and 2019, and they assessed cannabis resin, extract and tincture of cannabis, CBD, and THC. But again, they assess the medicines. What they assess, because it's both their mandate and both the framework in which they develop their actual work, which is the schedules, which are lists of drugs, lists of medicine. They are here to assess the medicine that are listed in these schedules and say if they have therapeutic potential or not, and if they are harmful or not. They are not here to assess a car painting or elements for processing in photographic development of photographs or food products. It's just not their mandate. WHO has other groups that work on food safety and stuff. This is a committee on drug dependence, so it's dependence to pharmacological products used in medicine. Their mandate is to assess drugs, so really it's limited to that.
And sorry, and just so the listeners know, we use a lot of acronyms. Michael is the king of acronyms here. So World Health Organization, when you hear us say WHO, that's the World Health Organization. And this expert committee on drug dependence is the actual name of that committee that Kenzi was just talking about. And that's the ECDD, or the committee. But WHO, World Health Organization. Thank you so much, Kenzi.
Well, I try to say WHO because people get crazy when I say WHO. But it's the same thing again with WHO, with WHO. In the end, when they made the assessment of CBD, they say the CBD products with less than 0.2% THC are not under control of the convention, and if they are above 0.2% THC, they fall under control of the convention. And we have to understand this is, again, really for medicines. So they are just talking about CBD medicine. For instance, Epidiolex. This is a CBD medicine. If it has less than 0.2% THC, it's not controlled by the convention, but it's still a medicine. If it has more than 0.2% THC, it's a medicine, but controlled under the convention. So you need to report to the INCB, as Michael was saying, and a series of stuff that the convention imposes. But it's just for medicine. So everybody's saying, oh my God, WHO is saying, is establishing a limit for to separate hemp from marijuana or this kind of stuff. It's just not what they are doing. What they are saying is just not applying to hemp. It's just not applying to food. It's not applying to anything that is not medical. So it's just applying to CBD, to medical CBD. CBD as a drug, as a medicine. It's not applying to vape pens, to cosmetics, to whatever thing we are thinking about. And apparently nobody understood that. People say, oh my God, it's terrible. WHO is trying to impose 0.2 as a standard, but we have 0.3. And the Swiss people are saying, but we have 1%. How can they impose 0.2? Oh, no, they are not saying that. It's just another topic. We are just talking about medicine here. So it's really restricted to medical uses, therapeutic context, the pharmaceutical, phytopharmaceutical sector, period, not hemp sector. And we should really, in a way, thank them for doing that, for saying we can just consider policies for cannabis as a medicine per se. They need to be considered by themselves. We need to assess cannabis as a medicine and not necessarily always assess everything in every discussion on cannabis. We don't need to bring hemp and to bring adult use and other stuff into medical use. We need to just talk about medical use because it's worth just talking about that. Please let us talk about medicines. That's what the WHO is saying.
And I just want to make sure, too, that the listeners know that in that June 2018 critical review, it goes through a preliminary review. When the WHO and the ECDD, Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, is looking at various substances, it goes through first a preliminary review, and then that preliminary review decides if it's going to go on to a critical review. So in the end, in June 2018, when the WHO ECDD released that critical review of the many findings around cannabidiol, they said these three main things. CBD is generally well tolerated with a good safety profile. In humans, CBD exhibits no effects indicative of any abuse or dependency potential, and that to date, there is no evidence of recreational use of CBD or any public health-related problems associated with the use of pure CBD. Just wanted to make sure the listeners got that in there. And back to you, gentlemen.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that, Joy. I want to insert sort of a marker, a side note on the treaty's legal obligations to nations that do sign it and become part of it. As I said, there's no enforcement built into the treaty. There's no blue hat UN police that are going to come enforce it or anything like that. In fact, as Kenzi was pointing out, or alluding to at least, United States has been the enforcer traditionally of the treaties. Going around and forcing countries to comply has been our role outside of the treaty's general bounds. So, but the one thing that I think is really, really important to understand is that, as Kenzi said, this is about medical use, but to put a real fine point on that, the treaty is a legal mandate recognizing that drugs are indispensable for the relief of human suffering and that they must be made available. These treaties sign this, and I was really tuned into this by Human Rights Watch, that this is actually kind of a legal obligation, especially for us in the United States, where we've signed into this treaty, we've ratified it, and according to our Constitution, that puts it at a very high level in our U.S. federal law, meaning that our U.S. federal government has to provide medicine. And any efforts of the DEA to restrict our access to medicine, like not allowing us to have cannabis as a medicine for 50 years, for example, is a violation of not just the spirit of the treaty, but it might actually give us some legal standing in sort of a world court, or at least the world public court of public opinion, and certainly standing in U.S. federal court, that you cannot restrict our access to medicines and use the treaty as a thing for that. It's just the treaty does not do that. It doesn't require that. It treats cannabis right now like an unknown, and the WHO is literally listed as the source of knowing medicines inside the system, and now we know it. Now the WHO says we know it, and the significance of this is that the World Health Organization has made this statement. It's held a completely contrary position, saying that cannabis was not a medicine. And based on that, and based on their expertise, and what I just said about their role inside the system, you could righteously have used the WHO and the treaty to say, oh, well, we don't know much about cannabis. Let's treat it only as a research drug. Let's make it very, very little, available for now. Like the Institute of Medicine came out in 1999. In the middle of the drug war, they said, yeah, we still need to let people have access to this. Let's restrict it down to those who are most in desperate need of it for now while we work this out. So even they recognized it. So that's where we've been. But now the World Health Organization has recognized that cannabis is a medicine, as they've done for CBD. CBD is an exceptionally safe product, and as you read, it does deservedly get that attribution. Cannabis is also very safe, and what they've done to make these kind of 5 recommendations simpler, and first of all, for those who want the complicated version, I definitely recommend you go over to the internet, go over to the Crimson Digest. And it's just fantastic work that Kenzi has mostly been instrumental of. I've helped, and others have put efforts into it. And the Crimson Digest, Volume 1, on the cannabis review process and on the stakeholders and the history, is just fantastic resource. You'll by reading that and looking through, you'll understand all this stuff. But very simply put, like for CBD, for example, CBD would be out of control at all if it's less than 0.2% THC. If it's got more than 0.2% THC, it would get thrown in with over-the-counter cannabis. The World Health Organization is recommending we have over-the-counter cannabis. It would be Schedule 3 in the treaty. And that would be up to each country, really, on how to do that. Like Uruguay, I could easily foresee, or Canada, I could foresee having literally over-the-counter whole cannabis products that they seem to feel are packaged well or in some way are preventative of abuse. That's the only requirement that the WHO made, is that there would be an effort to make these products less abusable. If they're a little bit more abusable, then what the WHO has recommended is just regular schedule placement for drugs. So it would no longer be treated like heroin. It would be treated like any other drug. You could just get a prescription, and you're not going to require a fancy triplicate prescription, just a freaking prescription. And I think that is kind of a cool way to do it for now. I think that it's really important. We're going to have this vote coming up in the United Nations on these recommendations in December. Looks like it's been delayed, it's been pushed back, pushed around, contorted in many ways. Again, the history is fantastic, and I refer you to Crimson Digest to read it. But we are here now, and it looks like we very well might have a vote. There's also a chance. There's been a lot of pushback and a lot of discussion about that CBD note. There is a chance that they'll push that back and send it back to the WHO and say, come back later with it, work on it some more. The United Nations has that opportunity to do that. But
May I ask you, for the listeners, because I'm not so sure, we spoke about it, absolutely, but I'd love to just be able to tell the listeners what those 5 recommendations are in a row so that they get them. Would that be okay?
Sure. I can try. So yeah, we have a series of recommendations. The first one is taking cannabis out of Schedule 4. So the numbering of schedules is different in the US. Schedule 4 is the highest schedule, but it doesn't really imply any particular policy. It's just really symbolic. We call it sometimes the prohibition schedule. It's just a symbolic schedule that says this drug is really evil and it should just not be used. So WHO said, definitely you gotta take cannabis out of this schedule. It's just symbolical, but it's necessary, and that's probably the most important of the recommendations. Then they say, because it's complex, we've been talking about the 1961 convention, but there is another one that you've been mentioning, the 71 convention, or Michael mentioned it, and THC as a molecule, as a pure molecule, is also listed in the schedules of the 1971 convention. So it's both listed as part of cannabis resin in the 61 convention and also in the 71 convention. WHO says, let's get it all together.
And I just want to make sure the listeners know that was called, just as the 1961 single convention on narcotic drugs, this is the 1971 convention on psychotropic substances. Just wanted to get the listeners to know that one.
And a side note there is that they didn't know what THC was back in 1961. It was discovered in 1965. So that kind of explains why it got sucked into the next treaty.
Another side note is that they did know what CBD was, both in 1961 and in 1971, and they didn't consider it relevant for scheduling in 1961, obviously because it was not getting you high, so no interest. And in 1971, they considered maybe it could be a precursor, so it could be used to be transformed into THC. So they considered maybe scheduling it as a precursor substance, but there was no schedule for that, so they just abandoned the idea, and it stayed like that until 2018 when they reassess TBD medicines and they get the outcome you just explained before. So yeah, so for the moment, THC is simultaneously a psychotropic substance, and there's a 71 convention, and part of the narcotic drug, and there's a 61 convention as part of cannabis, as part of cannabis resin, or as part of cannabis extract. So it's really complex. It's virtually, THC is scheduled in actually 5 different schedules because it's part of these different narcotic drugs, but it's also in the 71 convention divided. So delta 9 THC is in schedule 2, and the other delta 6, delta 8 are in schedule 1. So it's really complicated and crazy. And WHO said, look, it's just crazy. Let's put everything in schedule 1 on the 61 convention. It's the basic schedule. It's where we have the other the other sort of similar drugs, plant-based drugs, which are the coca leaf and the poppy plant, the actual poppy plant and poppy resin, which is opium. It's all in Schedule 1, and also their active compound, morphine, cocaine, are in Schedule 1. So let's put everything in Schedule 1. It sort of makes sense, even if it doesn't make sense from the point of view of actual harmfulness in terms of medicine. WHO says it should be scheduled lower than Schedule 1 because it's not as dangerous as the drugs in Schedule 1. But we understand it's also a geopolitical process. We have China and Russia pressuring. If we propose to just take cannabis out of the schedule, it's probably just going to be rejected. And we are here to help patients have easier access. So let's try to get up with something that is consensual and that can be adopted, that nobody can really oppose it, saying, WHO, you've gone crazy, you potheads. But that is still enough to provide more access, and that's what they recommend. Let's put everything in Schedule 1. So let's bring back THC from the 71 Convention to Schedule 1, and that takes a series of recommendations because as it's placed in several schedules, it's a lot of votes to in the end bring everything back in the 61 Convention, Schedule 1. So we would have...
If you don't, before you go into the rest of the recommendations there, Kenzi, I just wanted to put a fine point on something, that as the United States and other countries, Canada, for example, I know the way they've handled cannabis, even to this day, the Sativex product, for example, I believe is still handled as a research drug in the pharmacies up there in Canada. In the United States, cannabis is Schedule 1 only for research purposes, and you got to jump through 80 hurdles, as everyone knows. But the thing is, as they were able to use that legally, the treaty and the World Health Organization's naysaying about cannabis against us, we can use this positive World Health Organization against them. And what this does is it creates a legal obligation for medicinal access to the cannabis substances that are medicinal, that are going through the treaty, creates the absolute legal obligation for the United States to provide access to those. And this is important, regardless of whether the United Nations passes it or not. In the spirit of the treaty, the World Health Organization is the expert body. They've changed their mind. They've made a new recommendation. You have to go by that. And I just, go back to the United Nations. If they don't want to follow these rules, that's up to them. They can, shun this whole thing, vote the whole thing down, status quo, business as normal, and you will see a huge crack break in the side of the treaty. The treaty will be so completely vulnerable, and we win either way. I personally would much rather win by working with the system and evolving and growing, making the system be fit to purpose and make reasonable access to all medicines just a human right, as it is written in the human rights books to be, and kind of move on. But just want people to understand that even independent of what the United Nations does, this World Health Organization recommendations are landmark and absolutely revolutionary. And should the United Nations pass them, I'll go back to you, Kenzi, there was a couple more recommendations, weren't there? Or I think you said it, the moving from Schedule 4. So you have, for the U.S. listeners, you have a descheduling. You're removing it from Schedule 4. And the reason why I say it's a descheduling is because it's the Schedule 1/4 that is like heroin. If you take it the 1/nothing, then it's like everything else. If it's 1/4, then it's like crystal meth. That's the way it works. So the 1/4, you get rid of the /4, you deschedule it from 4, and that's a profound thing. And ironically, as much back and forth and there's been about the CBD note, there's been very, very little pushback at all about the Schedule 4 movement.
Attention Cannabis Podcast listeners. You can now listen to your favorite cannabis podcast ad-free with the MJBulls mobile app. Just download the free MJBulls mobile app to your smartphone to start enjoying cannabis podcasts with no commercials. Go to Apple Apps or Google Play to get the MJBulls Cannabis Podcast app today.
Let me get to the CBD note but indeed what you say is interesting. The fact that even though the recommendations are rejected by a vote with the pressure of Russia and China and a couple of really old school countries, let's say, even with that, we have the actual outcome of the expert committee on drug dependency, CDD. It's a report, the blue report. It's there, and it's already recognizing. Again, it's only talking about medicine, but when they talk about cannabis and cannabis resin, so phytomedicine, herbal medicine, whole plant, cannabis buds and cannabis resin, they talk about it, and they say
botanical, so to speak.
Botanical, as you say in the US, exactly. They say, well, we can't really put it out of the schedule and everything. We are sort of constrained, but we will assess it from the point of view of a medicine and say its level of actual harm and potential for dependence and risks and benefits in medicine. And they do it, and they say, well, it has harms, and they list the harms, which are dizziness, dry mouth, eventually issues with driving of motor vehicles. Needs more insight. They list a couple of harms like that, and you say, well, yeah, that's important to reduce this harm, and to address them and to be aware of them. But if you look at all the other substances they've been assessing, you see the harms always include death and a list of horrible, health outcomes that is just terrible. When you say, okay, these are actually harmful or potentially harmful medicine, even though they might have use in medicine, they have a level of risk that is really important. You compare that to their assessment of cannabis, and you say, well, yeah, there are some risks, dizziness and dry mouth, but just get the substance out of it. And this is an assessment of an international independent committee of experts. The ECDD is called by the WHO and so on, but they are independent. The WHO are not instrumental. The people working at WHO are not making any decision in this ECDD. It's an independent set of scientists with gender balance and geographical balance. They come from all countries of the world. They have different opinions. They are often really high-level experts, and they come up with this really neutral assessment, and this is going to stay for a long time, regardless of any political developments. So I think that's really something to consider. And just to finish with the recommendation, they made these 3 other recommendations that are one is really technical. There is this entry in the schedule. It's called extracts and tincture of cannabis, and they just propose to change it for preparations of cannabis, because it's just the way it works for other drugs, other medicine. You have the drug and then preparation of the drug. You have like opium and preparations of opium, coca leaf and preparations of coca leaf, morphine and preparation of morphine. So just put something normal. Let's make some normalization for cannabis and use the same language. So that's maybe really technical, but it sort of makes sense, because cannabis was in this status of really exceptionality, exceptional scheduling, being in Schedule 4, having so many entries, having THC split in different schedules, a really complex policy regime for nothing. So they really make a huge effort of simplification. Let's put everything in Schedule 1, and then the 4th recommendation says, up to every government, you can cherry pick in Schedule 1 the kind of cannabis medicine that you want, and you put them in Schedule 3. So Schedule 3, what Michael was saying before, is over-the-counter and a much lighter set of control, and basically the access that is already in place in most jurisdiction in the world where we have medical access of cannabis, be it in the US states or in Netherlands or in Israel. It's the kind of access that is already existing. It corresponds to Schedule 3 of the 1961 Convention, which is the lowest of the schedules. And so they say you can put cannabis medicine or THC medicines in this Schedule 3, and we leave it up to every government. It just has to be, not dangerous for public health, basically. So that's a great thing, because it allows Russia and China to do nothing and stay with almost virtually no access, by placing no cannabis drug in Schedule 3, but it allows the Netherlands to place botanical cannabis, like the Bedrocan they are selling in pharmacies, to say, well, we consider botanical, cannabis buds as Schedule 3, and then we just continue with what we have already. And that's probably going to help other countries that are currently experimenting medical cannabis, such as France, to take the step ahead and do like their neighbors. So that's really interesting recommendation. The fourth one, the placement in Schedule 3, up to the choice of every government. And then it will be up to every cannabis patients group in every country to pressure their government so as they consider the medicine that are useful for them in Schedule 3. So that's another work. Of course, the WHO is not solving all the problems like that. We need also to take it as a tool and follow up with the work on our local level. And finally, the last one, the most crazy one, is a recommendation on CBD. And I've already mentioned it. It's really simple. It just says the CBD-rich medicine that have less than 0.2% THC, you just can control them as medicines, not under international control. That's it. The CBD preparation that have more than 0.2% THC, then again, like any other cannabis medicine, either you control it as the Schedule 1, like any other drug, or you place it in Schedule 3, and you can provide an access over the counter. So it just, in the end, instead of a two-tiered classification for cannabis medicine, it's just for CBD medicine a three-tiered classification. But just for medicine, again, it's not concerning industrial products, vape pens, whatever thing is not a medical product. It's just not falling under this recommendation. So,
and I want to put a fine point on the CBD note, because the World Health Organization was answering a problem. They were answering an issue. And the issue is this: if you produce a CBD extract from medical marijuana, you've got a marijuana extract, aka a Schedule 1/4 drug, blah, blah, blah. If you get CBD from industrial plant, which is exempt from the treaty, then it's CBD exempt from the treaty. But they're the same bloody thing. And on top of that, they know, they don't live in a bubble. They know that there's CBD out there in the marketplace, and they darn sure knew about Epidiolex and the whole history of all that going on. So they did what was responsible. In this case, because the powers that be, Harry Anslinger and his group back in 1961, didn't know what they were doing, put cannabis into control in a way that didn't anticipate the future and didn't anticipate that the cannabinoids in cannabis were important, because they didn't think cannabis was important, and put us in this bind where now we've got this conundrum. The U.S. has complained. I think it's a pretty valid complaint. This is kind of a rabbit hole. The World Health Organization has already said that the reason why they didn't do other notes for other cannabinoids is because they weren't on their desk. They didn't have the research in hand. They weren't able to do a review. But they definitely didn't imply it. They definitely said that they would review those in the future and assess them individually. Therefore, you may wind up at some point with 67 different notes on different cannabinoids that are all like CBD valuable and like CBD not of any nuisance or any real problem to drug dependence or abuse. That's Harry Anslinger's legacy. What can I say? The note is fixing a problem. And I think the WHO kind of acted responsibly there and did the best that they could. And if you look at it in the context of medical, and you see it as just a line in the sand between two different, one place where you get it at the gas station versus one place where you get it over the counter at the pharmacy versus the next where you have to have the prescription, it actually makes sense. And that's what doctors try to do. They try to make sense. So anyway, go back to you, Kenzi.
Excellent. This is so great. Thank you. It's very complex, and being able to describe it that way, I know is so helpful.
Just related to what Michael just said, indeed, we have a legacy in this treaty that we have to deal with, and the WHO had to deal with it. Cannabis and cannabis resin, blah, 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 they are placed in the schedule of the 1961 convention, but they are also placed in the very text of the convention, Article 2, Article 28, they mention cannabis directly. They just put the word cannabis. So even if the WHO said, let's put everything cannabis THC out of the schedule and totally unschedule it, it will still be under control of the convention because it is present somewhere in the treaty, and the treaty actually is shaped around these 3 plants we've been talking about: coca plant, opium poppy plant, and the cannabis plant. The treaty has 3 legs, and it walks on 3 legs, which are these 3 plants. You can't just cut one of the legs of the treaty like that. It would lost. You need to rewrite comprehensively the treaty if you are to take cannabis out of it, and that's really not going to happen in the next 50 years, apparently. So, yeah, just an element of context. We are in this treaty that has 50 years, and that's probably going to be here for another 50 years. And we have to, if we want to help, hemp farmers continue to grow hemp, we have to reaffirm that hemp is exempt by purpose from the treaty. And if we want to ensure patients have access and doctors can make prescription and advise and make, pharmacovigilance, we need to deal with this treaty that is going to stay and do the best we can. And that's in a way what WHO, these experts of WHO have been doing.
The things that pop up in my head that you might want to close, in closing, talk about would be maybe some of the other players that are involved at this level. Fields of Green for All has been really carrying the ball at the UN, and Americans for Safe Access has helped us a lot in Geneva. The whole list of players, just really thanks to everybody, and that this has been a big coalition effort to work through the World Health Organization. It's not been something that the World Health Organization has felt our presence every step of the way. So I just want to leave you with that. And then the other thing would be to briefly give people kind of the rundown of what I think would happen should, let's say, in a perfect world, all the recommendations the World Health Organization has put forward get passed. And what I believe would happen inside the United States would be it would trigger a top-down review where we've been working from the bottom up and trying to prove cannabis is a medicine. Well, it's written into our Controlled Substances Act about this treaty obligation. So should the treaty obligation change, that's going to not go from the bottom up. It's going to go from the top down. I figure what'll probably happen is it gets handed off to the National Institutes of Health to look at it after the Attorney General determines what the change means, what the actual change requires. I would bet, given everything the Attorney General has had done, all the stuff that's happened in the last year or two, my guess is the Attorney General is going to say the treaty requires we schedule cannabis, that it has to be scheduled. So, and the fact that Marinol, the active ingredient in cannabis, is Schedule 3, I would say that the movement should absolutely require Schedule 3 at a minimum. And I would call that a correction, not even a reform, to put it in parity with Marinol. And then I would say the Attorney General is probably going to require like Schedule 3, 4, or 5. So I would say Schedule 5 would certainly be realistic for whole plant cannabis as a national policy as a result of this World Health Organization, full impact. I would hope for that, and I think that's what should happen.
And I also want to make sure the listener, and you did a wonderful job, gentlemen, making it clear, although when you're new to it, as you well know, heads are swimming, right? So at the United Nations level, Schedule 1 is the least restricted.
Yeah.
Schedule 5 is the most restricted.
Yeah, exact opposite. Yeah.
But in the United States, under the Controlled Substances Act, Schedule 1 is the most restricted, and Schedule 5 is the least restricted. So just want to underscore that.
You can't tell me that's not Harry Anslinger doing that on purpose back in the 1960s and 70s. He was in the position to be able to screw us up like that. That complexity of that has really held back our movement. And I just one last little comment before I hand it off to Kenzi. Really heartfelt thanks to everybody out there that's really helped us in Vienna and Geneva. Dozens of organizations, the entire hemp movement, the top echelon of the entire cannabis movement worldwide. And I really feel like when we're in there working, again, it's not this big, global UN thing. It's more like real people representing each country, trying to get through the day, trying to figure out how, to navigate this thing, which is all our legacy. It's handed down to all of us. So I really think that we can all work together on it, but our movement needs to step up and come to these meetings. Not just us anymore. The movement needs to show up en masse. It's time. It's time to change the world policy.
Aho, amen to that, brother, and then some, singing it from the rooftops. Ken, how can you wrap up this? We can't wait to have you gentlemen back on for even a third time, but how could we wrap this part up?
Well, I'd say maybe just with the agenda in the next month regarding this WHO recommendations, because it's the first change in the treaties since 1961, basically. So it's kind of important. So all the member states, almost 190 countries, are having private, almost secret meetings on Zoom or some kind of Zoom during the summer to discuss these recommendations. And they will meet in December in Vienna. There is United Nations headquarters in Vienna, Vienna in Austria, in the middle of Europe. And they will decide, finally vote on the recommendation. So they were expected to do it in March, and in March they were already expecting to do it after a delay. So they might again delay the recommendation in December, or at least part of the recommendation, because it's a big piece for them. But probably they will vote on part of them. And so in December, we will see big news, historical news of probably a change in the scheduling of cannabis at the international level, in the scheduling of medical cannabis again. So a huge step forward for medical cannabis, and we have to continue defending the fact that industrial uses of cannabis are not controlled by the convention. The convention is just a convention on medicines, and we should be able to reappropriate almost that convention and to say, in the end, if it's here to ensure access, well, we are here for that also. So let's work together and ensure access, really.
And what we're saying here is, when we say a vote, like any vote, whether it's the United Nations level, your town council, the state legislature, or the U.S. Congress, it's education, it's lobbying to get those votes, to influence and persuade those votes, and in our case, towards common sense, science-based, data-driven policy that liberates a plant and makes it accessible to humans. You too, and all of those groups that you mentioned. I want to give a real shout out to Fields of Green, and of course to ASA, the Americans for Safe Access, who I know you work with so closely up there. There were some real champions, and we all need to get more involved. But you are absolutely my heroes, gentlemen. I cannot wait to have you on for a third time so that we can talk about the global sustainability aspects of liberating this plant in all of its forms. That is a whole nother aspect to this that we have not addressed. And again, gentlemen, I cannot thank you enough for your work, my comrades, my brothers in the liberation of the world's most valuable, versatile plant. Thank you, Kenzi. Thank you for being with us, Michael.
A pleasure.
This is Joy Beckerman, and I want to invite everyone interested in the silver bullet of cannabis reform to tune into Hemp Barons on Wednesday, August 12th for the first of a critical 3-part series on the bedrock of near global cannabis prohibition, which is actually at the International United Nations level, and it's a global treaty called the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. If you want to be empowered with this essential knowledge, listen on the MJ Bulls mobile app or wherever you listen to podcasts.